The morning mist clung to the glass walls of the research tower, like ghostly fingers, creating a ethereal veil around the floating city of Ethros. High above the cloud layer of planet Zephora, the crystalline spires pierced through wisps of vapor, their surfaces gleaming with the amber light of the twin suns. At the pinnacle of the tallest tower, Dr. Lissa Keth pressed her palm against the cool transparency of her laboratory wall, watching the endless expanse of clouds roll beneath her feet like a cotton ocean. Her laboratory was a marvel of xenobiological engineering, filled with specimen containers that hummed with life-sustaining energy fields, holographic displays showing molecular structures of alien DNA, and monitoring equipment that tracked the vital signs of dozens of off-world creatures. But the crown jewel of her collection, the subject of her most intensive research, lay curled in the massive containment habitat that dominated the center of the room. Varkos was a cenithar, a creature from the storm-swept valleys of Zephora's southern continent. Standing nearly 8 feet tall when fully extended, his serpentine body was covered in scales that shifted from deep emerald to metallic silver, depending on his mood. 6 powerful limbs ending in retractable claws could tear through reinforced metal, while his elongated skull housed rows of razor-sharp teeth and eyes that glowed with an inner fire. Most citizens of Ethros would have recoiled in terror at the sight of him. But to Lissa, he represented the culmination of years of dedicated research into the behavioral patterns of Zephora's apex predators. She had raised Varkos from a hatchling, studying his cognitive development, his social behaviors, his responses to various stimuli. What she had discovered challenged everything the scientific community believed about cenithar intelligence. These weren't mere beasts driven by instinct and hunger. They possessed complex emotional structures, problem-solving abilities that rivaled some sapient species, and what appeared to be a rudimentary form of empathy. Her research papers had been met with skepticism and outright hostility from the Planetary Council, who viewed cenithars as nothing more than dangerous pests to be eliminated. The sound of the laboratory's entry chime interrupted her thoughts. Lissa turned from the window, expecting to see her research assistant arriving for the morning shift. Instead, a human male in maintenance coveralls stood in the doorway, looking decidedly uncomfortable as he clutched a toolbox in one hand and a work order tablet in the other. "Dr. Keth, I'm Darren Willis from Environmental Systems. I'm here about the water recycling unit maintenance." His accent carried the crisp consonants of the outer colonies, and his brown hair was still damp from the humid air of the city's lower levels. Lissa frowned, checking her schedule display. "I wasn't expecting any maintenance today. My research protocols require absolute environmental stability." Darren shifted nervously, glancing at the massive form of Varkos, who had lifted his head at the sound of an unfamiliar voice. The cenithar's eyes fixed on the human with predatory interest, and a low rumble emerged from his throat. "Emergency work order. Ma'am, the primary recycling processor in this sector is showing signs of bacterial contamination. If we don't flush the system today, you could lose water pressure entirely by tomorrow." He held up the tablet, displaying the maintenance authorization with its urgent red priority marking. Lissa sighed, recognizing the bureaucratic inevitability of the situation. The research tower's environmental systems were integrated in ways that made selective maintenance impossible. "Very well, but you'll need to work quickly and quietly. Any sudden noises or movements could agitate my specimen." Darren nodded, though his eyes kept drifting to Varkos with obvious apprehension. "I'll be as quick as possible, Doctor. The access panel is in the storage area behind your specimen containment." As Darren moved toward the rear of the laboratory, Lissa returned to her morning routine of checking Varkos's vital signs and behavioral indicators. The cenithar watched the human's movements with keen intelligence, his head tracking Darren's progress across the room. There was something almost calculating in that gaze that made Lissa pause in her data collection. She had been documenting Varkos's enhanced cognitive abilities for months now, noting improvements in his puzzle-solving skills, his ability to recognize patterns, and his responses to emotional stimuli. The Planetary Council remained unconvinced. However, viewing her work as dangerous anthropomorphization of a fundamentally hostile life form, they had made it clear that her research grant was under review, and any incidents involving her pet monster would result in immediate termination of her project and the destruction of her specimen. The sound of clanking tools and running water from the storage area provided a steady background rhythm as Lisa continued her observations. Varkos had settled back into his resting position, but his eyes remained alert, tracking every sound from the maintenance work. She made notes about his ability to distinguish between routine laboratory sounds and unfamiliar intrusions. Another data point supporting her theory about Cenithar intelligence. "Dr. Keth?" Darren's voice carried a note of concern from the storage area. "I'm having some trouble with the pressure valve back here. The whole system seems to be backing up." Lissa saved her data and moved toward the storage area, finding Darren crouched beside the water recycling unit, with his tools spread around him. The access panel was open, revealing a complex array of pipes, filters, and electronic components. Water had pooled on the floor around the unit, and Darren was using a small pump to clear the overflow. "What's the nature of the problem?" she asked, kneeling beside him to examine the exposed mechanisms. "The bacterial filter is completely clogged, and the backup system isn't engaging properly. I'm going to have to manually flush the entire network, which means disconnecting the primary flow regulator." He gestured to a large, cylindrical component that seemed to be the heart of the system. Lisa nodded, though her attention was divided between the maintenance work and her concern about Varkos. The Cenithar had risen to his feet and was pacing the perimeter of his habitat, clearly agitated by the disruption to his environment. She could see the color of his scales shifting toward the deeper greens that indicated stress and potential aggression. "Please work as quickly as possible," she urged Darren. "My specimen is becoming increasingly disturbed by the activity." Darren glanced toward the main laboratory, where Varkos was visible through the transparent walls of the storage area. "He's certainly impressive. I've never seen a Cenithar up close before. The news feeds don't really capture how intelligent they look." "That's exactly what I've been trying to prove," Lisa replied, surprised by his observation. Most people saw only the predatory aspects of Cenithar physiology, missing the subtle indicators of higher cognition. Varkos displays problem-solving abilities that suggest advanced neural development. The scientific community refuses to acknowledge the possibility that Cenithars might be more than mere beasts. As she spoke, Darren was working to disconnect the flow regulator, using a specialized wrench to loosen the connection points. The pipes groaned under the pressure, and suddenly, a jet of soapy water erupted from a loose coupling, spraying across the storage area in a wide arc. "Look out!" Darren shouted, but it was too late. The pressurized stream of cleaning solution, normally used to sanitize the water system, shot through the gap between the storage area and the main laboratory, passing directly over Varkos's habitat. The Cenithar, who had been approaching the transparent barrier with curious intent, was caught directly in the path of the soapy cascade. The cleaning solution struck his scales with tremendous force, covering him from head to tail in thick, sudsy foam. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Varkos reared back on his hind limbs, releasing a sound that was part roar, part shriek, and entirely alien. His scales, normally a controlled spectrum of greens and silvers, began flashing through colors that Lisa had never observed before. Brilliant crimsons, electric blues, and patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. The soap suds clung to his scales, creating an almost comical contrast with his fearsome appearance. But there was nothing amusing about his reaction. "What's happening to him?" Darren shouted over the Cenithar's vocalizations, struggling to shut off the water flow. Lissa was already moving, her hands flying over the habitat's control systems as she tried to activate the emergency containment protocols. "I don't know. I've never seen him react like this to any stimulus." Varkos began thrashing against the walls of his habitat with unprecedented violence. The transparent aluminum barriers, designed to contain a creature of his size and strength, began to show stress fractures under his assault. His claws, previously retracted during his captive years, extended to their full length and began scoring deep gouges in the flooring. The bioluminescent patterns on his scales were now cycling through configurations that hurt to look at directly, creating a strobing effect that filled the laboratory with chaotic light. The Cenothar's movements were becoming increasingly erratic. He would charge at one wall of his habitat, then suddenly pivot and attack a different section, as if he were fighting multiple invisible opponents. Foam continued to cascade from his scales, but instead of washing away, it seemed to be having some kind of chemical reaction with his skin. The scales were becoming more translucent, revealing underlying structures that pulsed with energy. "The containment field is failing," Lisa called out, her voice barely audible over Varkos's continued vocalizations. "If he breaks through, the entire laboratory could be destroyed." Darren had finally managed to stop the water flow, but the damage was done. The storage area was flooded, and foam continued to drip from the overhead pipes. He grabbed his emergency communicator, preparing to call for evacuation protocols. But Lisa stopped him with a gesture. "Wait," she said, studying the readouts from Varkos's biomonitors with growing amazement. "Look at these neurological readings." The displays showed brain activity patterns, unlike anything in her previous observations. The Cenothar's neural firing rates had increased by over 300%, with new patterns of connectivity appearing in real time. It wasn't just agitation or fear driving his behavior. His brain was literally rewiring itself, creating new pathways and connections at an impossible rate. "The soap," she whispered, pieces of an incredible puzzle falling into place. What kind of cleaning solution was in that system? Darren checked his equipment manifest, scrolling through the technical specifications. Standard enzymatic cleanser with surfactant enhancers and... Oh, there's a neural catalyst additive listed here. It's supposed to break down organic contaminants in the water supply. Neural catalyst, Lisa repeated, her mind racing through the implications. That would explain the neurological changes. The solution isn't just cleaning his scales. It's interacting with his nervous system at the cellular level. As if responding to her words, Varkos suddenly stopped his thrashing and stood motionless in the center of his habitat. The wild color patterns on his scales began to stabilize, settling into configurations that were hauntingly beautiful. He turned his great head toward Lisa, and for the first time in their years together, she saw something in his eyes that chilled her to the bone. Recognition. Not the simple recognition of a familiar caregiver, but the deep, complex recognition of one sapient being acknowledging another. The Cenothar approached the damaged wall of his habitat and placed one clawed hand against the transparent surface. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, almost ritualistic. Then, he opened his mouth and produced a sound that was entirely unlike his previous vocalizations. A series of modulated tones that carried the unmistakable cadence of language. "Dr. Keth," Darren said quietly, "I think your research just proved itself." Before Lisa could respond, the laboratory's communication system activated with the harsh tone of an emergency priority message. The holographic display materialized in the center of the room, showing the stern face of Counselor Vex, the Planetary Council's Director of Xenobiological Safety. "Dr. Keth, our monitoring systems have detected severe environmental disturbances in your laboratory. Preliminary readings suggest a containment breach involving your Cenothar specimen. You have 15 minutes to secure the situation before emergency response teams take direct action." The transmission ended before Lisa could reply, leaving her and Darren alone with a transformed Varkos and the weight of impending disaster. The Planetary Council's direct action meant only one thing: immediate termination of her research and the destruction of her specimen. Everything she had worked for, everything she had discovered about Cenithar intelligence, would be erased in the name of public safety. "We have to find a way to stabilize him," she said, moving toward the habitat controls. "If the Council sees him in this state, they'll classify him as an uncontrolled mutation and order his immediate elimination." Darren was studying Varkos with the eye of someone accustomed to solving mechanical problems. "The foam is still reacting with his scales. Maybe if we can neutralize the chemical reaction, his neurological activity will return to baseline levels." Lysa shook her head. "You don't understand. I don't want his activity to return to baseline. This is the breakthrough I've been hoping for. The neural catalyst has unlocked cognitive potential that was always there, dormant in his brain structure. If we can prove that Cenithars are truly sapient beings, it will revolutionize our understanding of Zephyrin ecology." "But the Council won't see it that way," Darren pointed out. "They'll see a dangerous predator with enhanced intelligence as an even greater threat to public safety." The truth of his words was undeniable. The Planetary Council's approach to xenobiology was fundamentally conservative, prioritizing safety and control over scientific discovery. They had barely tolerated her research into Cenithar behavior when Varkos was classified as a contained specimen. A Cenithar with proven sapience would be viewed as an existential threat to human colonization of Zephora. Varkos continued to produce his complex vocalizations, the tones becoming more structured and purposeful. Lysa realized that he was trying to communicate, using a form of language that was entirely his own. She began recording everything, knowing that this data might be the only evidence of Cenithar intelligence that would survive the coming confrontation. "There has to be a way to prove his sapience without triggering the Council's termination protocols," she said, pacing the length of the laboratory while her mind worked through possible solutions. "What if we could demonstrate controlled communication?" Darren suggested. "Show that he's not just making random sounds, but actually trying to talk to you?" Lysa considered the possibility. Her research had included extensive work on Cenithar vocal capabilities, but she had never observed the complex tonal patterns that Varkos was now producing. The neural catalyst had apparently unlocked not just intelligence, but the physiological mechanisms necessary for sophisticated communication. She approached the habitat wall where Varkos was still standing, his clawed hand pressed against the transparent barrier. When she placed her own hand opposite his, matching the gesture, his vocalizations took on a different quality. The tones became softer, more melodic, with a rhythm that suggested emotional content beyond mere information exchange. "He's responding to you," Darren observed. "That's definitely not random animal behavior." The laboratory's timer display showed that they had less than 10 minutes before the Council's deadline. Lysa made a decision that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. She began entering commands into the habitat's control system, preparing to lower the containment barriers. "What are you doing?" Darren asked, alarm evident in his voice. "I'm going to release him," Lysa replied, her fingers moving steadily through the safety override sequence. "If Varkos is truly sapient, then keeping him confined is not just scientifically invalid. It's morally wrong." "Dr. Keth, that creature could kill both of us before the Council teams even arrive." Lysa paused in her work, looking at Varkos through the transparent wall. The Cenithar's eyes met hers, and she saw no trace of the predatory hunger that had driven his wild ancestors. Instead, she saw curiosity, intelligence, and something that might have been hope. "No," she said quietly. "He won't hurt us. I've spent 3 years studying him, documenting his responses, learning his behavioral patterns. Even with his enhanced cognition, the fundamental core of his personality remains the same. Varkos has never shown aggression toward me or anyone who treated him with respect." She completed the override sequence, and the containment barriers began to lower with a soft humming sound. Varkos stepped back from the wall, watching the barriers descend with obvious understanding of what was happening. When the way was clear, he moved forward slowly, deliberately, giving both humans time to react if they chose to flee. Instead of charging or displaying threatening behavior, Varkos simply stood at the edge of his former prison and continued his complex vocalizations. The foam was still clinging to his scales, but the wild color patterns had stabilized into something almost beautiful, shifting auroras of blue and green that pulsed in rhythm with his breathing. Darren had backed against the far wall of the laboratory, his hand on his emergency communicator, but he made no move to activate it. There was something in the Cenothar's demeanor that defied everything he had been taught about these creatures. This was not a mindless predator, but a being with depth and purpose. Lisa approached Varkos slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. When she was within arm's reach, she extended her hand palm up in a gesture of peaceful intent. The Cenothar studied her hand for a moment, then carefully extended one of his own claws and touched her palm with surprising gentleness. The contact sent a shock of recognition through both of them, a moment of genuine interspecies communication that transcended language barriers. "Incredible," Darren whispered. "He understands what you're doing." The laboratory's communication system activated again, but this time the display showed not one, but 3 council members, their expressions uniformly grim. Councillor Vex was flanked by Director Thorne of Colonial Security and Dr. Raina Koss, the council's chief xenobiologist and Lissa's longtime professional rival. "Dr. Keth, our monitoring systems indicate that you have lowered the containment barriers around your specimen," Councillor Vex announced. "This constitutes a direct violation of your research protocols and poses an immediate threat to station security. You will restore containment immediately or face summary termination of your research license." Lissa stepped protectively in front of Varkos, though she knew the gesture was largely symbolic. "Councillor Vex, I need you to understand that the situation has changed dramatically. The chemical exposure has triggered enhanced cognitive development in my specimen. Varkos is demonstrating clear signs of sapient intelligence." Dr. Koss leaned forward, her expression skeptical. "Lisa, you've been making these claims for years, without substantive proof. Enhanced aggression is not the same as intelligence, regardless of what your emotional attachment to the creature might suggest." "This isn't aggression," Lisa protested. "Listen to his vocalizations. Observe his behavior patterns. He's attempting structured communication." As if responding to her words, Varkos stepped forward and began producing his complex tonal sequences directly toward the communication display. The sounds were unlike anything the council members had heard from a Cenothar before. Organized, purposeful, with clear emotional undertones that suggested meaning beyond mere noise. Director Thorne's hand moved to his security controls. "Whatever chemical reaction has occurred, it has clearly destabilized the creature's behavioral patterns. This represents an unacceptable risk to station personnel." "Wait," Darren said, stepping forward from his position against the wall. "Before you make any irreversible decisions, you need to see something." He pulled out his personal recording device and activated a playback function. The holographic display showed the moment when the cleaning solution had struck Varkos, but instead of focusing on the Cenothar's dramatic reaction, Darren had captured the subtle changes in his neurological readings. "I'm not a xenobiologist," he said, "but I work with complex systems every day. These neural patterns aren't random. They're structured, adaptive, evolving in real time. Whatever happened to this creature, it didn't make him more dangerous. It made him more intelligent." Dr. Koss studied the readouts with professional interest, her skepticism beginning to waver. The neural firing patterns are indeed unusual. The connectivity matrices are far more complex than anything in our baseline Cenothar data. Councillor Vex remained unmoved. "Enhanced intelligence in a predatory species represents an even greater threat than simple aggression. Dr. Keth, You have 5 minutes to restore containment before security teams take direct action. Lissa felt the weight of years of research and dedication pressing down on her. Everything she had worked for, everything she believed about Cenithar intelligence, hung in the balance. She looked at Varkos, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, even without comprehending the specific words being spoken. Then, in a moment that would forever change her understanding of xenobiology, Varkos did something that no one could have anticipated. He approached the communication display and, using one carefully controlled claw, began tracing symbols on the laboratory floor. The movements were deliberate and precise, creating geometric patterns that showed clear mathematical relationships. "He's writing," Darren breathed. "Those are mathematical equations." Lissa knelt beside the patterns, her heart racing as she recognized the fundamental principles of quantum mechanics expressed in visual form. The equations were not just random scribbles, but sophisticated representations of energy-matter relationships that required advanced understanding of physical laws. Dr. Koss was leaning forward in the communication display, her professional composure cracking as she studied the symbols. Those are graduate-level physics concepts. How could a Cenithar possibly know such information? Because Cenithars aren't the primitive predators we assume them to be, Lissa replied, her voice filled with wonder and vindication. The neural catalyst didn't create intelligence in Varkos. It unlocked intelligence that was already there, dormant in his brain structure. His species may have been advanced long before humans arrived on Zephora. Varkos continued his mathematical demonstrations, moving from basic equations to more complex theorems that dealt with interdimensional energy transfer and gravitational field manipulation. The implications were staggering. If Cenithars possessed such advanced understanding of physics, their apparent primitive behavior might be cultural rather than intellectual limitation. Counselor Vex had fallen silent, studying the display with obvious concern. The political ramifications of sapient Cenithars were immense. If Varkos's intelligence was representative of his species, then human colonization of Zephora might be occurring on someone else's planet. "Dr. Keth," Counselor Vex said finally, "assuming these demonstrations are genuine and not some elaborate deception, what do you propose we do with this information?" Lissa stood beside Varkos, her hand resting gently on his scaled flank. The Cenithar's breathing had stabilized, and the foam was finally beginning to wash away from his scales, leaving them with a lustrous sheen that seemed to contain depths of color she had never noticed before. "We need to establish formal communication protocols," she said. "If Varkos can learn to express complex mathematical concepts, he can certainly learn to communicate in ways that we can understand. This could be the beginning of the first true interspecies dialogue in human history." Director Thorne remained skeptical. "And what if this enhanced intelligence makes him more dangerous rather than more cooperative? A predator that can solve physics equations is not necessarily a predator that can be trusted." Varkos seemed to understand the nature of the discussion, because he moved to the center of the laboratory and began a new demonstration. Instead of mathematical symbols, he began arranging objects from Lissa's workstation in patterns that clearly represented peaceful intentions, tools laid down rather than grasped, defensive postures rather than aggressive ones, and finally, in a gesture that brought tears to Lissa's eyes, he carefully picked up a fallen specimen container and returned it to its proper place on the laboratory shelf. "He's showing us that he understands cooperation," Darren observed. "That's not the behavior of a mindless predator." Dr. Koss was taking extensive notes, her scientific curiosity overriding her initial skepticism. "Lissa, if your specimen can demonstrate consistent rational behavior and communication ability, this could indeed represent a paradigm shift in our understanding of Zephyrin life forms." Counselor Vex seemed to be weighing political considerations against scientific opportunity. "Very well, Dr. Keth. You will have a provisional extension of your research license, but under strict conditions. The specimen remains under constant monitoring, and any sign of aggressive behavior will result in immediate containment. There's one more thing, Lysa said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. Varkos isn't a specimen anymore. If he's truly sapient, then he has rights as a sentient being. We need to establish protocols for his care and treatment that respect his intelligence and autonomy. The silence that followed her statement was profound. In all of human history, the recognition of non-human sapience had been theoretical rather than practical. The legal, ethical, and social implications of acknowledging Varkos as a person, rather than a research subject, would reverberate throughout human space. Dr. Koss spoke first. The scientific validity of such recognition would require extensive testing and verification. We would need to establish baseline cognitive standards and develop appropriate assessment protocols. And I suppose you'd want to be involved in that process, Lysa replied, recognizing the opportunity for collaboration rather than competition. If you're willing to work together, rather than in isolation, we might be able to establish a comprehensive research program that satisfies both scientific rigor and ethical considerations. Darren had been quietly observing the exchange, but now he stepped forward with an unexpected contribution. If you're going to be working with enhanced Cenithar cognition on a regular basis, you're going to need better environmental controls. The cleaning solution that triggered this transformation was just an accident. But if you could refine the chemical composition and delivery method, you might be able to help other Cenithars achieve similar cognitive enhancement. Lysa stared at him in amazement. You're suggesting that we could systematically enhance Cenithar intelligence? That's incredible. But it would also be incredibly dangerous. If the enhancement process went wrong, we could create genuinely hostile super predators. That's why it would need to be carefully controlled and monitored, Darren replied. But think about the potential benefits. If Cenithars are naturally intelligent but have been cognitively suppressed by environmental factors, helping them achieve their full potential could lead to unprecedented cooperation between our species. Varkos had been listening to the discussion with obvious interest, his head turning to track each speaker as they contributed to the conversation. Now he approached the communication display and began producing a new series of vocalizations, these ones more musical and rhythmic than his previous attempts at language. He's trying to contribute to the discussion, Lysa realized. We need to develop translation protocols as quickly as possible. If Varkos has opinions about his own treatment and the enhancement of his species, we need to be able to understand them. Counselor Vex made his final decision. Very well, Dr. Keth. You will work with Dr. Koss to establish comprehensive research protocols for Cenithar cognitive enhancement. Mr. Willis, your expertise in environmental systems may prove valuable in refining the enhancement process. This project will have the full backing of the Planetary Council, but also its full scrutiny. Any developments that pose a threat to human safety will result in immediate project termination. The communication ended, leaving Lysa, Darren, and Varkos alone in the transformed laboratory. The morning mist had burned away from the tower's windows, revealing the full glory of Ethros, floating in the golden light of Zephora's twin suns. The floating city seemed to represent the potential for harmony between different forms of life, a place where human technology and alien intelligence could coexist and thrive. Lysa approached Varkos and extended her hand again. This time, instead of simply touching her palm, the Cenithar carefully grasped her hand in his own claws and began producing soft, melodic tones that seemed to express gratitude and hope. The foam had completely washed away from his scales, leaving them with a beautiful iridescent quality that shifted from emerald to silver to deep blue as the light played across their surface. So what happens now? Darren asked, beginning to clean up the water and debris from the morning's chaos. Now we learn, Lysa replied, never taking her eyes off Varkos. We learn how to communicate with him, how to understand his needs and desires, how to help other Cenithars achieve their cognitive potential safely, and most importantly, we learn how to share this world with beings who may have been our equals all along. Varkos released her hand and moved to the laboratory window, pressing his claws against the transparent surface as he gazed out at the floating city. His vocalizations took on a new quality, one that seemed to express wonder and possibility. For the first time in his captive life, he was looking at the world not as a prisoner, but as a participant in something larger than himself. The future stretched before them, filled with challenges and opportunities that none of them could have imagined when the day began. The accidental splash of cleaning solution had transformed not just Varkos, but the entire relationship between humans and the indigenous life of Zephora. What had begun as a simple maintenance call had become the first step toward a new era of interspecies cooperation and understanding. As the twin suns reached their zenith and bathed the laboratory in warm, golden light, Lysa began making plans for the work ahead. There would be communication protocols to develop, enhancement procedures to refine, and most importantly, other Cenithars to contact and evaluate. If Varkos was representative of his species' potential, then Zephora might be home to an entire civilization that had been waiting for the right catalyst to reveal itself. The day that had begun with routine research and mundane maintenance had ended with the discovery that would reshape their understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence between species. And at the center of it all stood Varkos, no longer a specimen to be studied, but a partner in the greatest scientific adventure of their time. The soap suds had washed away, but the transformation they had triggered would last forever, opening new worlds of possibility that stretched beyond the floating city, beyond the cloud-wrapped planet, and into a future where the boundaries between species meant less than the bonds of understanding and mutual respect.